Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this great event commemorating Sir Denis Mahon. My name is Hugo Chapman, and I'm the Simon Sainsbury Keeper of Prints and Drawings. And Henrietta has asked me just to sort of outline why it's such an appropriate place to honour Sir Denis. And sort of thinking about it, I came up with kind of three reasons, one of which is a more general one, which is, I think this is part of Sir Denis's, what would be called his sort of cultural quarter, because we're just around the corner from the Warburg Institute, which of course in the kind of post-war period was the great kind of centre for studying the Baroque, led by Sir Denis and others. And he certainly, during Sir Denis's researches on his great book, Seicento Art Theory, would have used the British Library, which in those days was here. You may have walked through the Great Court, where the British Library used to be, where all those great Seicento art theoretical books would be found, as they are indeed in the Warburg. Secondly, it was actually, he formed a great friendship and working relationship with Nicholas Turner. So at the end of the, after this lecture, we'll go into the study room because that's where Sir Denis and Nicholas, who started work here in 1974, began on the huge opus of cataloguing Guercino's drawings at Windsor Castle. Over 800 drawings. It is an enormous sort of doorstopper, and that really is the book that everyone who works on Guercino drawings has to go to, because it is fundamental in terms of dating and in working out. And much of that work was done here, with the drawings being delivered in batches to Princeton Drawings, and then Sir Denis and Nicholas working on them, and the book was published in 1989. And lastly, I think it's very appropriate, really the very, very particular, which is where you are. You're seated in our show of new acquisitions, and there are, which both, I think, gives a sense of what we're having tonight, which is about the links between old art and new art, which was something dear to Sir Denis, but also you've got on my right a work by Nicolas Poussin, the earliest known drawing by Poussin, predating his departure for Rome. And as Sir Denis, one of Sir Denis's many triumphs was the very accurate dating of Poussin's work. I know that he'd have been delighted to see that. But there are also other Baroque artists here, Simon Vouet to the right, and Pietro Cortona and Bernardo Strozzi. And I like to think, although Sir Denis, of course, was the great kind of rescued Baroque art from really being ignored by the art historical establishment, I like to think that there was always an interest in Baroque art, at least amongst lovers of graphic art. So he would have found amongst his cohort of scholars here at the British Museum, like Popham and John Gear and Philip Pouncey, they too loved Baroque art, not quite maybe with the intensity that Sir Denis did, but certainly Baroque art and the great artists like Guercino and others had never fallen into the same kind of disrepair that they had in terms of painting, which of course Sir Denis raised them up. So for all those reasons, it is a very appropriate place to honour Sir Denis, somebody that I was certainly very sort of proud, and in fact I sort of sometimes have to pinch myself that I kind of met this great titan of post-war British art history. But he was still very, very active, and as I've described in my kind of piece in this lovely publication, I've never met anybody who used a walking stick for such great kind of emphasis and as a kind of aid to making his point. And I wish I could at this point bang my own walking stick, but I introduce Orietta Adam to continue the introductions.
Thank you. The 8th of November is Sir Denis Mahon's birthday, not to be forgotten. And he was born in 1910. And many of you will remember, in fact, that we celebrated his birthday and achievements every year on this day. This tradition remains, which is why we're here this evening. And I'm aware that the city of Cento, the birthplace of Guercino, Cristiana, is also organizing a separate celebration for him tonight. Dr. Gozzi sends regards and best wishes to all of us and joins our celebration as well. The Sir Denis Mahon Charitable Trust, of which Suzanne Marriott, Alan Bryant and I are trustees, was created by Sir Denis in his lifetime. It aims to continue Sir Denis's philanthropic work, his art historical research, and his passionate promotion of young scholars. It promotes his art collection and lifelong works and studies to the general public, organizes exhibitions, supports museums, and also endows 2 annual prizes for young scholars and artists, the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize and a drawing prize at the Royal Drawing School, of which Suzanne will tell you more later. The Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize is an annual prize for young scholars to write on the periods of art that Sir Denis studied or on subjects that he was interested in, with a presentational lecture of the winning essay at a renowned public institution. We're very privileged to host Sir Denis's Essay Prize at the British Museum this year. And on behalf of the Sir Denis Mahon Charitable Trust, I would like to thank Hugo Chapman and his colleagues for having made this possible. I would also like to thank all the judges at the Essay Prize, whose names and contributions appear in the catalogue, which, as Hugo Chapman has already said, has been published this year by the Burlington magazine. The winner of this year's Essay Prize is Magnus Rena, with his essay, An Archetype of Ruin, Graham Sutherland's Devastation in East 10th Street. Please welcome the 2018 winner of the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize this year, Magnus Rena.
Thank you, Orietta. It's a real honor to be speaking here this evening. Can everyone hear me all right now? Is that good? Okay, nodded heads. My talk, as Orietta said, is based on an essay I wrote entitled An Archetype of Ruin, Graham Sutherland's Devastation in East End Street. So we'll just get into it. Scenes of desolation and destruction are no longer unfamiliar sights to the contemporary viewer. Photography from battlegrounds in the Middle East has normalized a kind of imagery more menacing than the nostalgic visions of natural decay. Palmyra's architectural monuments faced a far more explosive and ideologically driven demolition than these ruins at Paestum. It is appropriate that devastation, the focus of this talk, is not simply a term for great destruction, but of overwhelming grief and horror. My argument is that Sutherland injects this archetype of ruin with the horrific rapidity and psychological torment specific to the Blitz. So I'm going to break this talk down into 4 parts. First, perspective, how it both engages and unsettles the viewer and how it creates drama. Then, how devastation can be interpreted as a modern, wartime reimagining of certain earlier romantic tropes. Then I'll examine Henry Moore, a friend of Sutherland and a fellow trustee with Sir Denis at the National Gallery, and how both artists working at the same time under the same war artist scheme expressed the horrors of the Blitz in similar ways. Finally, we'll consider religion and devastation, more specifically here, the painting's wavering between optimism and despair, and the ambiguity and complexity that might surround its religious outlook. So what exactly are we looking at? It's a painting of 2 rows of recently destroyed houses, surrounded by rubble and debris. Perspective dominates and dramatizes the scene. The composition is poised theatrically between order and chaos, light and darkness, each rigid facade, still with remnant connotations of safety and peaceful domesticity, competes against the surrounding murky sprawl of inky debris to create drama. Perspective, the optical manifestation of order and rationality, becomes the visual equivalent of drama in the face of such chaos. This is the first instance of Sutherland recycling a theme of dilapidated architectural scenes. Filippo Morghen was a successful but largely unknown 18th century Florentine engraver. It is important he's not avant-garde, but represents a convention and tradition of artistic production. He takes static temple ruins and enlivens them through a sharp, crisp use of perspective. Sutherland does exactly the same thing, but Sutherland accentuates the psychological effects. His scene is desolate rather than histrionic. This theatricality introduces the viewer or even the spectator into the image. In a duality of movement, perspective forces the street backwards, receding mysteriously into the dark canvas, and simultaneously it opens itself out for the viewer, drawing us into a reflective, self-conscious state, aware of our own position relative to the scene. Perspective becomes a mediator between the individual and the whole. It represents an opposition between totality and singularity in the painting. An isolated street, a singular vanishing point, the individual self-conscious viewer, are set against a multiplicity of forms. The anonymity of multiple houses on an unspecified road, astray in the nightmarish emptiness of the surrounding darkness. Perhaps this dichotomy is a visualization of the tragic phenomenon of wartime death and suffering, between widespread pain and individual tragedies. The abstract immensity of thousands, millions of deaths and a single bombed street, and the suffering which that entails on a far more human and comprehensible tier. I believe that what we see here is a microcosm of London's suffering, condensed into a single East End street. Perspective also has a sterilizing effect, draining the scene of life and nature. This is Red Tree, painted 5 years earlier. Immediately, differences arise on almost every layer of analysis. But what is pertinent to Devastation is that Sutherland refrains here from any use of perspective in order to cultivate an organic environment of natural contours. Swollen, arabesque forms and warped tendrils rest on the flat, abstract red background in a near dreamlike state. The only intimation of depth is given by the layering of darkened forms. The heavy use of perspective in Devastation therefore engenders exactly that which Red Tree deliberately rejects. Without any fluidity of line, the converging facades reach a lifeless, arid quality. Paul Nash's Totus Mere, or Dead Sea, painted in the same year as Devastation, deploys perspective for similar means. Nash was painting from an Oxfordshire airfield, a dumping ground for broken machine parts and old aircraft paraphernalia. He transforms that mass of German aircraft and aircraft equipment into a brittle, frozen sea tumbling onto an imaginary shoreline. This conflict between the waves' energetic swells and the inflexibility of metal generates a deathly drama. Nothing moves. It is something static and dead. Nash's scene of destruction still harbors connotations of flying and rapidity in the mechanical wreckage. Forms still have a motion in their jagged ebbs and flows. Contrast that to the mournful air of empty, motionless silence. A stillness of both form and function. Airplanes are built to fly, houses are built to stand still on rigid foundations. Let's look closely again at the foot of Morghen's engraving. Huddled groups, predominantly men, infest the ruins like ants crawling over scraps of food. They're included as visual records, proof, as if colonizing the antique world, that they were there. By contrast, Sutherland exchanges the conquering presence of figures with an emptiness. Just as the inanimate forms in First World War painting, craters or broken trees and mud, are interpreted as indirect expressions of loss, the residential scene here reminds the viewer of exactly what is missing. To include figures would disrupt the sharp composition and would alleviate the desolate, despondent atmosphere. This work forms part of a whole series of Devastation paintings. and drawings. And compared to the rest, East End Street has clarity and balance. Here, Devastation House in Wales unleashes complete explosive power. An outburst of beams and girders surge from the vanishing point. Look at how these vigorous diagonal forces appear doubly energetic in comparison to the jagged, rectilinear vertices of the flanking brick walls. East End Street seems subdued and deathly quiet by comparison, the compositions inciting completely antithetical reactions in the viewer. If we're confounded by the explosive force of the foreshortened beams in Devastation, in House in Wales, then we are transfixed by East End Street's expansive, inky depths and led into an intensely contemplative state. Once again, tropes reappear from archetypal, picturesque scenes of ruin. The religious sanctity of symmetry and balance in Hubert Robert's L'Église de la Sorbonne, en ruine, is challenged by the debris of collapsed rafters and shattered masonry. Chaos strewn across the foreground, yet in the midst of all this drama, like Devastation, the atmosphere is quiet and reflective. It is the distinction between this aura and the deafening power of House in Wales, which is pivotal to the religious potency of Sutherland's work. Oops. The countryside played an important role in Sutherland's childhood and early life. Family holidays at Swanage and his boarding school in Sutton nurtured his interest in the outdoors, exploring the hills and farmland which would inspire much of his work. However, the landscapes he chose would offer elusive inspiration, and he found it testing to paint directly from nature. Sutherland's perennial word to describe his own work is paraphrase. His paintings are transmutations of the original subject matter, using a different stylistic vocabulary altogether. I feel Douglas Cooper's description of him as a nature painter is too simplistic and neglects his extended periods of inward reflection, a habit inherited from Blake and Palmer. I would argue that Sutherland's lengthy introspective process led to the psychological impact of his work, and its anchoring deeply in the viewer's mind. This might explain how an East End Street, which, judging from the number of studies, took far more time than the rest of his drawings, is imbued with a meditative quality that eludes the others. His determination to let subject matter gestate in his mind is at the heart of his treatment of nature and of Devastation's composition. By 1941, British Romanticism had broken free from a traditional imagination of the English countryside and had developed an emboldened, colourful, and impassioned response to the mysteries of nature. Peckham Wood inherits the same Arcadian harmony as Samuel Palmer's The Bellman: agriculture, labourer, wilderness entwined. You could play a guessing game of whose is whose. They're so similar in style and tone. Both engravings hark back nostalgically to an English pastoral serenity. Man, satisfyingly weighed down with tight bundles of ripened corn, has organized his livelihood without encroaching upon nature or disturbing its beauty. This rose-tinted view of the past is typical of depictions of downfall and decay. In an aquatant etching of the ruins at Paestum, just like Morgan, the artist here includes figures. Tucked away in the bottom left are a clutch of admiring onlookers. They discuss the ancient columns which dwarf them. Is not their sense of awe, gazing up with raised hands and arched backs, similar to the unrealistic idealism of Peckham Wood and the Bellman? They glorify a past they never knew. By the time Sutherland was engrossed in Palmer's etchings, Britain's empire had diminished, and its particular rural sensibility had become hopelessly distant. If Palmer mourns a romanticized England, then the fractured, geometric rigidity of Devastation, reeling from humanity's destructive failure to foster a habitable future. But those worlds are antithetical. Far more expressionistic is the comparison between war-torn London and Sutherland's lightning-stricken oak. It seems to scream with pain, writes Robert Rosenblum. I've included this quote because I think it captures perfectly the trunk's anthropomorphic quality, and though the results differ, I think Devastation incites pathos by similar means. Just as Rosenblum speaks of the bizarre magnification of the tree, in Devastation, a sadly ordinary sight, a bombed street, is magnified to reverential proportions and becomes a monument to national suffering. The oak's crippled torso and clasped knot gain all their power from its twisted and buckled frame. It is dead in a literal sense, but energy still seethes through the line and form of its carcass. Burnt out, blasted oak clings to life like the soil under its desperately curled roots. So the East End Street, with its arrow-straight projection, loses all vitality. There is no pathos-inducing nature in the industrial scale of wreckage. While other paintings from the series reach an anthropomorphic quality, drooping and falling like a wounded animal, their entrails hanging through floors, East End Street remains stern and inert. It is the lack of wiry, anthropomorphic forms that leads to such a hauntingly sterile scene. Devastation is compelling because even the dregs of life retained by the form and composition of the neo-romantic blasted oak are swept away. Sutherland's mastery of light creates an ominous and unsettled atmosphere. A critic at the time described llamas as the day's last light falling gently upon the thatched roofs, a perfect complement to such a scene of pastoral harmony. In Devastation, the harsh, ambiguous light creeps across the left facade and smothers the crumbling brickwork. Objects glow mysteriously, but no longer in the crepuscular rural air. Nowhere either is the glorifying, mysterious glow of Robel's Église. The light is more complex. It clarifies form, yet unnerves the viewer. The soot-stained yellow highlights and accentuates the emerging street. The colored patches streak the surface, give emphasis to the form and variety to the eye. Moreover, the nature of the light itself is ambiguous. It seems to enter from the rear on the right, but it's unclear. Sutherland's perennial sunset motif seems to have seeped into the most barren and mechanistic of subject matters, with unnerving psychological effects. Perhaps a fire, burning behind Sutherland's point of view, causes the golden matte reflections off the building, or maybe something else. Irrationality arises and filters into the nocturnal atmosphere. The unbridled unconscious is at play. Perhaps the color simply symbolizes the eeriness felt so palpably within the scene. Ambiguity prevails over certainty. In September 1940, enforced blackouts plunged the city into darkness, weighing Londoners down with a unique psychological reliance on light. There's a fascinating study by Angela Wright called The Wartime Nocturne in British Painting, which draws parallels between electrical light and the nation's wavering optimism. Following the National Grid's completion in 1933, mains power became an anchor for civic productivity. Electrical power represented comfort, continuity of life itself, and the maintenance of essential war production, tangible proof that war had not wreaked havoc across England. Though it posed a risk, it allowed necessary work to continue in the darkened hours. The word blackout became a synonym and symbol of a shutdown on intellectual life and leisure. Meredith Frampton's triple portrait, with a ridiculous title, in London's Civil Defence Room, exemplifies this reliance on nocturnal security. Cocooned underground, a trio of confident, sharply dressed men continue to work, the darkness at street level almost forgotten. Everyday items, a cup and saucer of tea, a glass milk bottle, are nestled into this severely decorated room as desperate reminders of domestic comfort. How far East End Street is from that security and comfort of the home. Coloured maps, annotated charts are propaganda pieces, reassuring civilians that everything is under control. Sutherland's painting must represent the place from which these men have fled, where the safety of the national grid has been eradicated. Electrical power no longer reaches the empty windows along Devastation. Even Frampton's ominous archway, a reminder of the darkness which lingers at street level, cannot contend with Sutherland's frenzied sprawls of black graphite across the sky. This entire body of work would not have come about if not for the War Artists Scheme. That program devised in part by Kenneth Clarke at the Ministry of Intelligence to commission artists to record the war, or perhaps, as Sutherland and Moore have certainly done, to transcend reportage and create genuine works of art. Moore's depictions of Londoners sheltering underground in tube stations are haunting and deeply humane responses to the Blitz. In Grey Tube Shelter, the viewer is confronted with ghostly stares, embraced infants, and a sense of stoic unity. Herbert Reed summarizes these drawings as the most authentic expression of the special tragedy of this war, its direct impact on the ordinary mass of humanity, the women, children, and old men of our cities. Reed knew too well the psychological impact which war could inflict on the artistic mind. A perturbed T.S. Eliot came to him before the bombing had even begun, asking him to take his books and clothes to the country for fear that his alarming visions of shelled houses would come true. My proposition is that the horror of war infuses Moore's perennial theme of womanliness and the female form with a visceral, deeply emotive quality. he adapts the themes of his earlier sculpture, particularly reclining women, and raises their humanity to a new level. Each supine form might be elevated to a kind of classical recumbence. One can imagine one of these figures slotting into the pediment of a Greek temple. In doing so, Moore displays an art of accessible, commonly shared experiences and raises the working-class Londoner's suffering to a register of antique tragedy. It is important, too, that Moore's drawings introduce the notion of community to our discussion of devastation. The loose pyramidal structure here gives a solidarity and completeness to the group as they align, almost choreographed, parallel to the picture plane against the alienating gaze of the viewer. In Sutherland's work, however, the vestigial row of terraced houses is suggestive only of a former community. The terraced houses are devoid of hierarchy. An anonymous equality is consistent between the unified symmetry of the street and the nondescript expression on Moore's figures. However, in the drawing there still is an implicit social order. Their position is subordinate to those who look upon them. In between air raids, a dystopian zoo-like interaction developed as wealthier civilians would venture down into the tube to peer at the shelterers who felt, one of them remembered, it was degrading because they gave the impression they were looking down on us. As discomforting as that might sound, the most unsettling thing is that because of Moore's heightened position over the shelterers, we are involuntarily party to this hierarchy. Tilbury Shelter and Tube Shelter Perspective both adopt a raised vantage point. Immediately, their subtle reminiscence to Greek sculpture is overshadowed by their lethargic, hollow, skeletal forms. Being supine or prostrate or prone, remarks T.J. Clarke in his new book, Heaven on Earth, is never far from lolling about and groveling. He refers to Bruegel's Land of the Cockaigne, but I think it's applicable to these languishing figures too. Despite Moore's respect, their pitiable state is inescapable. Still, there is an enveloping comfort. The ribbed arches, dim light, and close bodily contact conjure up a womb-like environment of underground security. The inexorable darkness of the tunnel is disquieting, but also reassuring. The viewer senses instantly that, much like Frampton's portrait, the figures are deep underground, protected. To say that this cylindrical chamber incites claustrophobia is too simplistic. There is something consolatory about the figure's state of fetal enclosure. Underground, they are near to being entirely unconscious of external suffering. Devastation, by contrast, feels exposed and helpless in a barren and expansive composition. It is interesting to look at Sutherland's Tin Mine at Declivity, painted only 1 year later. The enclosed tunnel, warm from the earthy Palmeresque tones, reds and browns, still echo the fetal security of Moore's drawings, but only distantly, whereas the cool hardness of rocky textures is alleviated in Moore by a solidarity of figures. Sutherland's barren composition gives Moore a sense of chthonic entrapment, an anxious parallel to wartime fear and unease. You might even want to go as far to say that these enclosures are mythical visions of the underworld. Moore depicts living bodies ensconced in hellish chambers. They all share a deep recession into the black nothingness. Here, a downward spiral of diminishing forms, then a crisp corridor of darkness stretching deep into devastation, and a descent into the beginning of existence. And despite devastation's expansiveness, the sky still has a murky density to it. The thick black streaks protrude beyond the lighter, distant portion of street. Doom prevails over London with an apocalyptic air common to both works. In his thesis on Moore's drawings, Alan Wilkinson writes, "The subterranean setting is timeless and anonymous. The bodies swathed like Egyptian mummies seem to belong more to the dead than the living. And on one level, mummification has corpse-like associations, but on another level, it draws attention to their swaddled clothing, a protective bodily enclosure that bears the same fetal evocation as the environment. These figures are caught directly between life and death, between womb and tomb." So finally, let's consider a religious reading of Sutherland's work. At the time he was painting, Britain's retreat from France in May 1940 had provoked fears of a full German invasion of England, and alongside the fight and determination to recover, a sense of doubt was palpable. Sutherland pulls the viewer into this psychological battleground between a deteriorating war effort and an abiding religious expectation for salvation. Open to the heavens, with the symmetry and linear perspective of a holy structure, the East End street is glorified as a cathedral in ruins. The subtle presence of a cross, an axis formed by the central road and the perpendicular swathes of black, elevates the street further. However, unlike the golden shafts of sunlight illuminating Robel's Église de la Sorbonne, Sutherland cannot yield to such simple hopefulness. In a strange equilibrium, the cross in East End Street is glorifying, yet unnervingly corrupting. Its terrestrial composition of dark rubble and inky black entirely inverts its proper ethereal quality. The same dichotomy occurs in the heavens above the street. Typical crucifixion scenes are open to a clear sky. This is too, but the sky here has been infested and blackened by the streaky inconsistencies of crayon and watercolor. If the street, or the whole of bomb-damaged London, can be understood as a martyrdom in the face of German oppression, then Devastation does become a quasi-crucifixion scene, the pathos of self-sacrifice transposed from people, as in Moore's drawings, to those people's homes. Unavoidably, our interpretation of Sutherland's painting will differ from his. Tate Britain's recent exhibition, Aftermath, was curated with the gift of hindsight. The title, an agricultural term for new growth after the harvest, is inherently retrospective. Included in the exhibition was this painting by Paul Jouvet, which, like Devastation, has a silent sense of absence, the unworn helmet's emptiness similar to that of the wrecked houses. However, imbued in the metallic shine is a sense of honor and sacrifice unfamiliar to Devastation, a feeling amplified by the soothing optimism of petals blossoming behind. I would argue that in its curatorial context of Aftermath, the viewer almost misconstrues the springtime hopefulness of a branch as a symbol of certainty: the war will end, peace will prevail. Sutherland's painting does not have this proleptic optimism, as visitors do to Aftermath. For him, the war is yet to continue for 4 more years. Nevertheless, I do think that Devastation clings to a hope for resurrection. Take a cursory glance at this poster design. You'd think Sutherland is unequivocally optimistic. The composition is split, progressing from the left-hand side's darkness and ruin to the right's cliché vision of a heavenly blue sky and bright green pastures. A white butterfly, almost a dove, links the two sides, projecting an aura of peace onto the Arcadian half. Of course, the poster is a propaganda piece. The fact it never even gets circulated is testament to its overly sanguine tone. However, the annotation on the back of the print, "Can spring be far away?" is an insight into Sutherland's thoughts. It's difficult to discuss the tone of such a statement, whether it is sincere or indicative of a near loss of faith. Either way, it was completed 12 years before Devastation, enough time for confidence to dwindle. What convinces me that Sutherland's faith, a belief in the potential for London's resurrection, had not deteriorated by 1941, is his comment in an interview 10 years later. In a 1951 publication of The Listener, he comments that a crucifixion is the most tragic of all themes, yet inherent in it is the promise of salvation. It is the symbol of the precarious, balanced moment when the sky seems superbly blue, and when one feels it is only blue in that superb way because at any moment it could be black. And on that point of balance, one may fall into great gloom or rise to great happiness. Look at Sutherland's painting, and one does fall into great gloom, but deep within that tragedy still remains the promise of salvation. In the last couple of minutes, I'm going to finish by talking about the painting's relation to funerary architecture, a medium intrinsically linked with resurrection. In its darkness, symmetry, and perspective, it echoes the somber quietness of classicized tombs, except instead of using another, older, traditional image of architectural decline, let's take a painting which also adapts and plays off this tradition, but from well after the war had finished. Anselm Kiefer's Sulamith, painted in 1983, is a huge, gritty canvas depicting a Wagnerian Nazi crypt. Its Piranesian perspective immediately draws out a similarity to Devastation. The faint flickers of a pyre, minuscule against the brutal solidity of the surrounding masonry, are raised as if on an altar, a humble motif to the Holocaust. In an ironic and poignant shift, what was originally built as a Hitlerian monument becomes a Jewish one. Just as Robel painted from his imagination and Morgen's subject matter was far from its original size and glory, Kiefer's crypt was destroyed decades before he started painting. For him, one feels the psychological impact of war has shifted over time. Sutherland's interpretation of the architecture of ruin is an immediate and explosive process, whereas Kiefer, with no direct expression or experience of the war, is preoccupied with memory. A sense of shame victimhood, and mourning which have had time to fester in the German conscience. Devastation is an effective response to the horror of war because it does not mourn the gradual decline of a community, but is shaken from its rapid and traumatic destruction. Standing in front of the painting, one loses all sense of time. It exists in a state of fallout. While the sun is setting in Peck and Wood's nostalgic twilight, transporting the viewer to a nostalgic, longed-for past, in Devastation it is set long ago. Time has ebbed and flowed, but now stands still. The clash of timelessness and explosive immediacy is foundational to the painting's tormenting impression. Its power lies somewhere in between the lasting majesty of Paestum's heavy columns and the horrifying travesty of Palmyra's demolished ruins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Sir Denis would have been particularly pleased to read your essay on Graham Sutherland, who was a contemporary of his, a friend, and also an artist he particularly admired. As well as being one of the most important artists of post-war Britain, Graham Sutherland was, like Sir Denis, a believer in the merits of pro bono publica, and there is some fascinating correspondence in the Sir Denis Mahon Library and Archive in Dublin, documenting their joint efforts during the post-war years. As well as the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize, we are here tonight to celebrate the Sir Denis Mahon Award at the Royal Drawing School. The aim of the Royal Drawing School is to raise the standard and profile through teaching and practice. It is one of only a few institutions in the world offering in-depth quality tuition in drawing from observation. Founded in 2000 by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and artist Catherine Goodman, the Royal Drawing School runs the Drawing Year, an intensive MA-level postgraduate programme offering artists up to 30 students the opportunity to focus on drawing from observation for one whole academic year. All students are awarded a full scholarship, studio space, and receive tuition from a distinguished faculty of over 75 practicing artists. The school also runs the Foundation Year, a full-time skills-based course for 18 to 19-year-olds, the Young Artists Programme for artists aged 10 to 18 who have an aptitude for drawing, and delivers a programme of daytime and evening drawing classes which are open to the public and accessible to the widest array of students. The Sir Denis Mahon Award was created in 2011 to honour the memory of Sir Denis Mahon and his lifelong passion for painting and drawing. During his lifetime, he was a great supporter of the Royal Drawing School, formerly the Prince's Drawing School, and this annual award was created to give a recent graduate of the Drawing Year the opportunity to continue to focus on drawing from observation and to develop their work. A prize of £10,000 is awarded by the Sir Denis Mahon Charitable Trust to an outgoing Drawing Year student to enable them to continue their practice as an artist, and the award goes towards a studio space for the duration of the year, as well as a solo selling exhibition. It seemed fitting this year to bring together the Essay Prize and the Sir Denis Mahon Award. So I'd now like to invite you into the Prints and Drawing Study Room to meet the artists who have been the recipients of the Mahon Award since 2011. The works they have brought with them are in fact for sale, should you wish to buy them. And then please also join us afterwards for dinner in the Great Court Restaurant. Thank you.